A wealthy businessman's sleek black car screeched to a halt outside the iron gates of the Sterling mansion. He'd driven 3 hours to pay respects at his late friend's grave, but what he witnessed in that front yard stopped him cold. His best friend's 7-year-old daughter, the child he'd once watched climb onto her father's shoulders, laughing without a care in the world, now lay crumpled on the wet lawn, barely breathing.
Her stepmother stood over her, not helping, just watching.
The little girl had 37 days left to live. Maybe less. In that split second, everything changed. Because this businessman wasn't just anyone, he was the one man her father had trusted with a secret. A legal document hidden in a wooden box.
A promise that could save her life. Or destroy a family's carefully constructed lies. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it?
By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video.
What happened next would expose shocking secrets.
Ignite a legal battle that made headlines, and prove that sometimes one person's courage can change everything. Sit back, get comfortable, and let this story remind you why we fight for those who can't fight for themselves. And now, let's begin. Afternoons in the Silver Garden community always moved at a deliberately slow pace, like an old habit.
The paved street in front of the residential gates remained immaculate, with rows of trees casting soft, dappled shadows across the asphalt.
There was, however, one stretch of sidewalk where residents quickened their step, the walkway passing in front of the mansion at number 118. Some explained that the house was simply too lonely and silent. Others claimed they just wanted to avoid the heaviness that invaded them when they accidentally heard a child's muffled crying from inside. Whatever the reason, their eyes always looked straight ahead as they passed. No one dared turn their head to take a peek. The grand property belonged to the Sterling family, a name synonymous with influence in the business world. At the helm of corporations where their decisions held the power to reshape countless lives. After the untimely passing of Marcus Sterling in an accident a year ago, authority over the home and assets had transferred to his second wife, Victoria. Since then, the mansion, once filled with the cheerful sounds of a happy family, had become a place people actively avoided. This wasn't due to its imposing exterior, but rather the rumors circulating in hushed voices that the atmosphere inside was far from peaceful. Emma, Marcus's biological daughter, was the 7-year-old girl frequently mentioned in those unsettling whispers. She was fragile, her small shoulders usually hunched inside a worn pink dress frayed from excessive use. Her hair was thinning, revealing patches of reddened, irritated scalp, likely due to some medical treatment. Doctors had previously declared her condition unusual and difficult to manage, meaning the time she had left could be counted in frighteningly small numbers. To make matters worse, Emma had been forbidden from leaving the house for months. Victoria called it keeping the child safe, but no neighbor had ever seen her embrace or comfort Emma. Do you remember a time when you witnessed something that felt wrong but weren't sure if you should speak up? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Victoria, for her part, always presented a polished, immaculate image, maintaining a sophisticated bearing and a perfectly constructed social smile. That facade vanished the moment the property gates closed behind her. Everyone inside the house was acutely aware of this, especially James, the longtime groundskeeper. James felt a deep affection for Emma but opted for silence.
Pressured by the responsibility of supporting his 2 young children at home,
life had forced him into a precarious space between truth and duty. Not far from the mansion lived Helen, an elderly widow who had spent more than half her life in the area. She had known Marcus well, and he occasionally asked her to watch Emma when business kept him occupied. After Marcus's passing, Helen noticed that the windows of 180 no longer glowed with the warm light they once held. Instead, faint cries filtered into the night air, interspersed with Emma's stifled, choked sobs. Helen had hesitated many times, but an unspoken promise from years ago with Marcus always compelled her to linger a moment longer whenever she passed by. Have you ever made a promise to someone that you struggled to keep? Share your story. Sometimes we all need to know we're not alone in these moments. Edward Sterling, Marcus's cousin, also made frequent appearances at the house. It was known he'd been Marcus's business partner,
But since Marcus's passing, Edward's visits seemed to carry a more ambiguous purpose. He remained in the study for hours with the door firmly shut, opening it only for important phone calls. Edward never stopped to talk with Emma. Occasionally his gaze swept over the child, quick as wind. Neither warm nor cold, simply carrying a silent, calculating air. On this particular day, the weather was cooler than usual, and the lawn slightly damp. A pale gray sky settled over the mansion, giving the impression that time itself was crawling. Emma had been feverish since morning but was still ordered to tidy the courtyard. The familiar broom slipped from her hands when a brief wave of dizziness caused her legs to buckle. Victoria approached immediately, her eyes clouding with unmistakable irritation. She forced Emma to kneel on the stone patio, ignoring the shivers racking the small girl's body. If you saw this happening to a child, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. Your answer might inspire someone else. Emma clutched her worn teddy bear, the only object she had left from her father. The frayed fibers reminded her of the last night Marcus told her a story, his voice warm and gentle, his hand resting on her back like a comforting blanket. That sensation now felt more distant than ever. Emma lowered her head, holding her breath as the fever made her feel utterly exhausted. Suddenly, Victoria grabbed the collar of the child's dress, pulling hard. Emma stumbled, her hand seeking support in the air but finding only the cold ground. That action made Helen, watching from behind her own garden fence, hold her breath. She focused on every minute movement, knowing it was time to clearly record everything that was unfolding. Meanwhile, James stood near the front gate, his hands gripping his keys tightly, his heart torn by conflict. He watched Emma struggle to maintain balance before gently collapsing to one side. Yet he didn't step forward to help because Victoria was right there. Going against her could cost him his job, and James knew he couldn't let that happen. Just as Victoria was about to pull Emma again, the sharp sound of screeching brakes cut through the air. A luxurious black vehicle stopped abruptly in front of the gate. Helen startled slightly at the figure emerging from the driver's seat, a swift, dynamic bearing with sharp eyes that nonetheless showed the fatigue of someone who had traveled a long distance. She recognized him instantly. It was Richard Hayes, Marcus's former business partner. Richard was a successful entrepreneur in the tech sector who had spent many years abroad. To him, Marcus wasn't just a close friend but a brother who had shared his most challenging moments. Marcus's passing had left a profound void in his life. Who in your life has been more than a friend, someone who felt like family? Drop their name below and tell them you're thinking of them. Richard had returned to the city, this time intending to visit his friend's grave and settle some matters related to Marcus's charitable foundation. But the commotion in the front yard stopped him cold. He didn't even have time to ask anyone what was happening before the vision of Emma collapsing on the cold stone floor stopped him completely. She was so small against the vast expanse of the courtyard. Her body curled up, her hands trembling as she tried to grip the ground. She seemed so fragile that even a slight push could leave her motionless. Richard moved toward the gate without hesitation, his face hardening, his eyes so intensely focused that James, in the act of opening the gate, took a slight step backward. As he passed, the wind whipped his heavy coat, but it wasn't enough to slow his stride. All his attention was fixed on Emma, who was trying to use the last of her strength to inch away from Victoria. Have you ever witnessed someone stepping in to protect a vulnerable person? What happened? I want to hear about the heroes in your life. Victoria registered Richard's presence as he approached the patio. Her face froze momentarily. The hands gripping Emma's collar stopped for a fraction of a second. James watched her reaction, realizing that Victoria's usual confidence evaporated in those brief seconds when her eyes met Richard's. The air in the courtyard practically solidified as Richard took another step, his shadow enveloping the section of stone floor in front of Emma. The child's breathing was shallow and shaky from fever and exhaustion, her hand still clutching the teddy bear while seeking a rare moment of security. Victoria stepped back half a step, but managed to maintain a facade of composure. James looked from Emma to Richard, uncertain what would happen next. And Helen remained hidden behind her gate, her hand pressed against her chest. As if to prevent her heart from beating too fast, Richard walked directly toward the patio while James still wavered between the impulse to stop him and the need to remain silent. Richard's determination forced James to widen the gate, though inside the groundskeeper felt as if he were teetering, having crossed a line he'd always avoided. When was the last time you had to choose between doing what's safe and doing what's right? Tell me about it. Victoria froze at the scene, her hands still not releasing Emma's collar. In that instant, all layers of pretense on her face seemed to crack. She tried to maintain an air of calm, but the glances she cast between James and Richard inadvertently betrayed her fear of being scrutinized. Emma could barely stay upright as Richard knelt down and gently lifted her. Her hand gripped his jacket so weakly it was almost only a faint touch. She nestled her head into his shoulder, a natural reflex seeking a safe harbor. Her weight was minimal. It felt as if he were holding a body lacking the complete warmth a child should possess. In that moment, Richard didn't utter a word. He simply adjusted his grip so Emma's head rested securely against his chest, as if fearing even a slight movement might cause her to slip away. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment about this story and rate it from 1 to 10. How are you feeling? If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of peace and reflection as you follow this healing story and its journey of courage and justice. Outside the fence, Helen followed Richard's every step. What she had feared for months was now visibly evident. She knew what she had to do. The promise to Marcus still persisted somewhere in her memory. She immediately pulled out her phone and called a contact in the community, someone who had helped her with previous reports. She wasn't sure of the outcome, but she understood clearly this matter wouldn't conclude in silence like the others. In the courtyard, Victoria seemed anxious to stop Richard, but her confusion appeared to cement her feet to the paved ground. When Richard's car pulled away from the gate, she remained motionless for a long moment. It wasn't concern for Emma that held her. It was the fear of what Richard might discover once they reached the hospital. That anxiety stretched tautly through her mind, forcing her to grip the doorframe for support. She knew Richard was the only person Marcus had trusted enough to hand over his entire household if necessary. If he appeared here today, everything could take a drastically different turn. What do you think Richard will discover at the hospital? Drop your predictions below. Let's see who gets it right. At the hospital, the emergency room lights shone relentlessly. Richard waited outside with hands tightly clasped, watching the medical team wheel Emma into the treatment area. With each movement pushing the gurney, he felt the profound fragility of her small body. In that fleeting moment, he remembered the times Marcus had boasted about his daughter, his voice brimming with pride while describing Emma climbing onto his shoulders to reach the highest flowers in the garden. These memories made the hospital air feel suffocating. When the doctor emerged, he reported that Emma had missed a critical number of necessary treatments. Her health indicators were alarmingly low, and without proper care, the time she had left would be significantly shorter than initially projected. Richard listened without interruption, simply exhaling sharply through his nose as if containing an overwhelming wave of emotion. That Victoria had allowed the child to reach this state was something he could never overlook. If you were in Richard's position right now, what would be your first action? Tell me in the comments. About 10 minutes later, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's former private physician, hurried toward Emma's room. Upon seeing Richard, she stopped and took a sharp breath as if what she'd feared for so long had finally occurred. She explained that for months she hadn't been allowed to see Emma because Victoria had repeatedly canceled follow-up appointments, citing the child's need for rest at home. Sarah had continued monitoring Emma's health records through the hospital system and had repeatedly noticed abnormally low readings. She handed Richard the medical notes she'd saved, which clearly indicated Emma wasn't just sick, she was also lacking the most basic level of care. Richard reviewed each line, his hands slightly tense. He said nothing, but his gaze became deep and heavy, like a gathering storm. Sarah understood instantly that Richard wouldn't stop at an emergency hospital visit. He would seek the complete truth of the story. Have you ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? Share your story. It might give someone else courage. In the corner of the security area, James stood silently, watching nurses pass by. News of Emma's hospitalization brought him both a sigh of relief and paralyzing anxiety that made his palms sweat. He knew what he possessed could change everything. Yet a part of him still hesitated, fearing the repercussions. For the past 2 years, he'd been continuously saving video clips from the old security cameras at the mansion, knowing he'd need them someday. But to whom should he give them, and when? Those were the questions that kept him awake many nights. Finally, seeing Richard alone outside the room, James understood the choice couldn't be postponed. He took a deep breath, walked closer, and stopped a few seconds to steady himself. Richard. Richard turned at the sound of James's slow steps. Neither spoke immediately. James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small hard drive. The action made his shoulders tremble slightly. Richard accepted it without asking questions. James simply nodded subtly, as if to convey that the drive's content would help Richard understand the entire narrative. And James knew he'd just accepted significant risk. Meanwhile, at 118, Victoria sat in the study, constantly turning the bracelet on her wrist. When Edward entered, she stood immediately. They spoke in rapid, short, urgent phrases. Victoria worried that Richard might uncover the secrets within the house. Edward demanded she control the narrative before Richard took things too far. Emma's hospitalization was completely unexpected. Both understood that if Richard kept investigating, their carefully drawn plans regarding Marcus's will risked total collapse. Edward left the mansion with a somber look, while Victoria remained staring toward the patio. Damp marks still persisted on the stone where Emma had knelt earlier. She clenched her hands into fists, as if trying to physically contain the fear swirling in her mind. What secrets do you think Victoria and Edward are hiding? Make your guesses below. Back at the hospital, Sarah led Richard to her small office where she kept a special file Marcus had given her before his passing. It contained detailed instructions for monitoring Emma's health, notes about worrying symptoms Marcus had observed, and the last lines he'd written to Sarah, asking her to help care for his daughter if he ever left. Richard paused longer when he reached that section. He placed his hand on the paper as if trying to reconnect with something belonging to his old friend. The creases on the page were like the months Emma had endured in silence. Unknown to anyone, Richard realized he'd returned too late, but not too late to fulfill Marcus's final hope. Do you believe people can sense when they're running out of time? Have you ever had that feeling? Share below. When Richard returned to the hospital room, James stood outside the door with hands in pockets, as if concealing his nervousness. Richard gave him a slight nod, then entered and connected the hard drive James had given him. The first frame appeared. Emma sweeping the patio on a cold afternoon, her breath coming out in thin clouds like mist. The dress was too large for her body, forcing her to hold the hem with one hand while trying to maneuver the broom with the other. Victoria appeared in the frame a few minutes later, and Emma flinched with a familiar reaction. Richard stared at the screen. The atmosphere in the hospital room became so quiet he could hear the rhythmic beeping of Emma's heart monitor. His breathing grew heavy. Each image in the video was a raw, brutal blow of reality he was forced to accept. The footage continued, leading Richard to a scene where Emma struggled to lift a pot from the stove. She staggered too weak, her hand trembling as she touched the handle. Only seconds later, her legs gave out. The sound of the object hitting the floor made Richard instinctively grip the chair's armrest. Sarah remained silent, watching the scene. A long pause followed until Richard slowly exhaled, as if trying to avoid jumping up immediately and acting rashly. It wasn't just once, Elena murmured, her eyes still fixed on the screen. The bruises on her arms couldn't have occurred if she was being properly cared for. Emma was forced to perform tasks far exceeding her strength when her body was severely weakened. Richard leaned toward her. How long has this been happening? Sarah responded quietly. At least a few months. I called repeatedly. Victoria always said the child needed rest at home.
The answer led Richard to look at his hands as if struggling against an impulse to react violently. He nodded slowly, his eyes becoming clearer. Sharper, the gaze of a man who had decided to see something through to the end. If you discovered evidence like this about a child, would you have the courage to act? Be honest in the comments. Near the door, James stood uncomfortably, opening and closing his hands. He took a step inside the room, then stopped. Well, I don't know if I should let you see all this. James looked at Richard, then at Sarah. But Marcus was always good to me. I couldn't look away anymore. Richard turned his chair, his voice low and firm. I know you're worried about your children. If you help, I'll protect you. Thank you. James lowered his gaze, thinking it over. I just ask one thing. Don't let them know I was the one who gave you the drive. I still have 2 little ones at home. You have my word, Richard said softly but firmly. James nodded slightly. As if he'd finally entrusted a heavy burden to the right person. What would you sacrifice to do the right thing? Tell me about a time you had to make that choice. In the Sterling mansion, the atmosphere was completely different. Edward stood by the window, arms crossed, listening as Victoria recounted Emma's hospitalization. His face was tense with the strain of a man who prioritizes power above all else. Richard Hayes returns to the city just when everything's falling apart, Edward declared, still staring at the garden. It's not an accident. Victoria sat behind the desk, twirling a pen in her hand, unaware she was digging it painfully into her palm. He saw Emma in a state I never wanted anyone to witness. But Edward turned, his eyes sharp as a scalpel cutting through the concern in her voice. We must act immediately. What are you planning? Victoria whispered. Edward placed a file on the desk. We need to adjust some paperwork. A few entries in the medical record, not much, just enough to sow doubt that Richard's exaggerating everything. He lowered his voice. I'll get some board members to block Hayes from accessing any documents about Marcus's will. Victoria narrowed her eyes. And public opinion? I'll handle that, Edward responded. We'll launch some rumors, something about Hayes trying to take Emma to gain influence over the property. The smaller media outlets will pounce on that. Victoria took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. Do it before this spins completely out of control. Do powerful people always think they're above the law? What do you think? Drop your opinion below. In the Silver Garden neighborhood, Helen noticed rumors spreading like wildfire. Some neighbors whispered that Richard was trying to take Emma to dispute the inheritance. Hearing this infuriated her so much she immediately took a taxi to the hospital. When she entered the hallway, Richard was talking with the doctor. She approached, placing a hand on his arm to get his attention. Richard, they're making up stories about you, she said quickly, as if fearing she'd forget something. Victoria wants everyone to believe you took Emma for the money. Richard looked at her, his eyes softening slightly, knowing she was worried about the child. Thank you for warning me. I suspected they wouldn't stop there. Sarah approached, having heard the conversation. If Victoria's starting to spread rumors, we need someone on the legal front. I think you should call Attorney Morrison. Richard nodded instantly. I'll meet with him. Have you ever been falsely accused of something? How did you handle it? Share your experience. Someone here might need to hear it. Attorney Morrison arrived that afternoon in the hospital conference room. He was the man who had helped Marcus draft many important contracts. Lean, with a perpetually calm expression. As if accustomed to all the grim situations powerful families face, Richard handed him the files and the hard drive. Morrison sat down and played the first video clips. When he saw the scene of Emma sweeping the patio in the middle of the night, he paused for a second, not from shock, but because he understood the legal implications behind it. Edward will try to erase all traces, Morrison said softly. But if we act now, we have the advantage. I need you on my side, Richard said. Help me safeguard Emma. Morrison closed his laptop. I'll handle this case. That decision made Richard feel he was no longer alone. In the small hospital room next to the sleeping child under soft yellow light, an unprecedented alliance began to form. Sarah, the guardian of all medical records.
James, the man with direct evidence. Helen, the living witness. Morrison, the legal line. And Richard, the center of the conflict. Who would be in your alliance if you had to fight for something important? Name them in the comments. As Morrison began drafting the lawsuit, Victoria received news from one of her contacts that Hayes' attorney was looking to take the matter to court. She immediately called Edward. "We're losing control," Victoria said, her breathing agitated. Richards brought the doctor and the lawyer into this. "He's not going to let go." Edward paused a few seconds, then responded with a cutting tone. "I'll handle it. And I'll start with the weakest link in his group." That night, James returned to the mansion for his shift. As he entered the parking area, two unfamiliar men approached. They said nothing, simply positioned themselves to block his path. One leaned in and pronounced a concise, fragmented phrase. "The boss wants to remind you not to interfere." The words tensed James, though no one touched him. He clearly felt the mounting pressure as they walked away. James stood motionless for a few more seconds, his chest aching with worry for his young children at home. He knew this battle had escalated far beyond one child's difficult situation. This was a conflict between those who held power and those who simply wanted to live in peace. Have you ever been threatened for doing the right thing? What happened? Tell your story. Late that night, James sent a text to Richard. "The child needs you. They came looking for me." Richard read the text the moment his phone lit up. There was no longer any doubt in his heart. He stood and grabbed his coat. Sarah saw him preparing to leave. "Something wrong?" Richard just nodded slightly. "James is in trouble. I have to go see him." Richard drove along the deserted road where streetlights cast thin yellow stripes across the wet asphalt. He maintained a firm grip on the steering wheel, but constantly glanced at his phone on the passenger seat, checking if James had sent more messages. The phrase, "they came looking for me," repeated in his mind, suggesting what happened tonight wasn't a simple warning. It felt like the prelude to a real conflict. James's rental apartment building was an old block of floors a few streets from the Sterling mansion. As Richard climbed the stairs, the hallway light on the second floor flickered twice, went completely dark for a few seconds, then came back on. On the floor, a scrape mark stretched as if someone had exited hurriedly. Richard stood still for a moment, observing his surroundings before knocking on the door of 2B. James opened the door quickly, as if he'd been waiting right there. His face was marked by exhaustion, eyes sunken, shoulders sagging as if burdened by a great weight. "You came." James stepped aside, inviting Richard in, but not daring to close the door firmly for fear of making noise. In the small room, James handed Richard an envelope placed on the table. "They left this by my door. I didn't want to open it, but then I did. Take a look. Have you ever received a threat that made you question everything? How did you find the strength to keep going? Share below." Richard pulled the paper from the envelope. Inside were only a few short lines, but they were enough to convey the true intention. "James, watch what you do. Don't put yourself in danger." Below was a printout of James's work schedule. Every shift circled in red, a reminder they knew exactly where he'd be at any given moment. James clenched his hands. "I just want to do the right thing. But I have 2 young children. I can't allow anything to happen to them." Richard folded the paper, looking at James with a firm gaze. "I won't let you stand alone. If they force you to quit, I'll take care of you and your family. I promise. Thank you." James lowered his head, his breathing slightly tremulous. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe Marcus," Richard said. "And Emma only has us." That moment pushed James to exhale sharply, as if finally letting go of a deeply rooted fear. "What promise would you make to protect someone vulnerable? Tell me about it." While the two continued talking, Richard's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. It was Helen calling. "Richard, I think I'm being watched." Her voice was low and urgent. "There are 2 people standing at the end of the alley near my house. I've never seen them before." Richard tightened his grip on the phone. "Don't go out. Lock all your doors, turn on the lights. I'll notify Morrison. Don't leave." Does this have to do with me going to the hospital? She asked, a mix of concern and skepticism in her voice.
It could be, Richard responded bluntly.
But I won't let them touch you.
He hung up and turned to James. They're expanding their reach.
It's not just you.
James took a deep breath.
That means they're starting to get scared.
If you knew speaking up would put you in danger, would you still do it?
Be honest in the comments. Meanwhile, at the Sterling mansion,
Victoria hurried down the dimly lit hallway toward Edward's study. She was slightly trembling from a phone call with the lawyer that morning. Richard has requested an emergency guardianship order, Victoria said as soon as she entered.
If that order is granted, I lose everything.
Edward stood by the bookshelf, his hand lightly tapping files on the desk.
We haven't lost yet. I'm going to speak with a board member.
He owes me a favor.
What about the press?
Victoria asked, her voice dry from tension.
I've already contacted them. They'll start circulating the story that Hayes wants a piece of the inheritance.
Edward closed the file. Your job is to remain silent and completely out of sight. Victoria nodded, but her palms were slippery with sweat.
She knew that with each passing moment, things were slipping from her control. Do you think the truth always comes out, or can powerful people bury it forever?
What's your take? At the hospital, Sarah coincidentally discovered that Emma's old file had extended periods more than 3 months without updates. She flipped through the pages, finding days when the child should have undergone specific tests but were inexplicably omitted.
Richard and James arrived just as she was looking at the logbook.
Sarah showed them the file. 3 months without following the correct schedule.
That's why the child deteriorated so rapidly.
James looked at the file, his face paling.
For at least those 3 months I heard her coughing every night. But Victoria still made her do chores.
Richard placed the file on the table, his expression grave.
We'll add this section to the lawsuit.
Sarah nodded.
Morrison's waiting in the conference room.
If you discovered a child was being medically neglected, what would your first move be? Tell me. In the hospital conference room, Morrison reviewed the new documents.
Sitting silently for a few seconds as if organizing his points of attack.
Good. I'll add this to the file we're submitting tomorrow morning. But from now on, Richard, you must limit your exposure to the press. Edward will use it to smear your reputation.
Understood,
Richard responded.
My priority is being here for Emma.
The meeting concluded, and Richard exited the room still holding the medical record. He walked down the long hallway, the white ceiling lights reflecting off the glass panels on both sides as he turned toward the patient wing.
A nurse rushed toward him from the end of the corridor.
Mr. Hayes, Emma is being moved to the critical monitoring unit.
The words made everything in Richard stop for an instant.
Then he ran toward the emergency room, his feet barely touching the floor,
his breathing growing heavier with each stride.
Have you ever received news that stopped you in your tracks?
What was it?
Share if you're comfortable. Richard's breathing still hadn't stabilized when he reached the emergency room door.
The sounds of monitoring equipment were constant, stressful beeps.
Inside, the medical team was adjusting Emma's breathing tube. She lay on her side, her chest rising very weakly and falling rapidly,
as if afraid to breathe too deeply and cause more pain. Sarah stood by the bed, her hand resting on the metal railing. When she saw Richard arrive, she approached him.
She's past the worst, she said quietly, her eyes showing a hint of fatigue.
But Richard, one more emotional pull, and I'm not sure her body has the resistance to recover. Richard watched Emma through the glass panel. The child was curled up, arms tucked tight against her chest as if trying to find a personal safe zone. He pressed his hand against the door, trying to keep his voice firm, but unable to hide his anguish. I hate that she's being dragged into adult matters.
She doesn't deserve this. Sarah nodded slightly. The best thing you can do now is give her a calm environment.
All the external stress. Let us handle it piece by piece. When you see a child suffering, what goes through your mind? Tell me. Sometimes we need to process these feelings together. In the hallway,
James was immobilized, seemingly stuck in the doorway. His gaze fell when he saw Emma with the breathing tube.
When Richard came out, James lowered his head as if trying to hide something. I look at her and feel guilt. James gently clenched his hands. On cold nights I saw her sweeping the patio. I knew it wasn't right, but I did nothing. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, not an accusation, but a simple, gentle gesture to let James know he wasn't alone. You're on the right side now, James. Marcus would be grateful. James let out a soft sigh, his eyes shining with the emotion men often try to hide. I just hope she pulls through. Have you ever carried guilt for something you didn't do? How did you find forgiveness from others or yourself? Before they could say more, Richard's phone buzzed forcefully in his pocket. Morrison had sent a message. Victoria just released the article. You need to see it immediately. Richard opened the link. On the screen was an article with a large headline. Its tone loaded with manipulation. Tech magnate interferes in Sterling family affairs. Intentionally kidnapping owner's daughter to seize assets. The image of Richard holding Emma at the hospital was juxtaposed with distorted quotes from unidentified neighbors. James looked at the screen behind him, his face paling. They've started. Richard narrowed his eyes, reading the short paragraphs. A cold sensation ran down his spine, not because he feared being attacked, but because he understood this would directly impact Emma. She was too weak to withstand more turbulence. Sarah came out of the room and, seeing Richard's expression, knew instantly what had happened. Don't read anymore. Let Morrison and me handle that garbage. If you let this affect your state of mind, Emma will feel it. Richard inhaled deeply and nodded. I'll focus on the child. Across the city, a swarm of reporters converged on the gates of the Sterling mansion. Victoria emerged with a practiced smile, her hand resting delicately on the stone railing as if she were a devoted mother, who had just endured great turmoil. Edward was in the study, looking through the window, observing Victoria's every word to the press. She spoke of a mother's anxiety, the child's rights, and the shock of a stranger appearing and taking Emma without permission. Several reporters scribbled notes frantically. The sight pleased Edward. But when Victoria returned to the room, her expression sank. Edward, what about James? He knows too much. Edward interlaced his fingers, his voice low and cold. I sent someone to remind him. If he keeps helping Richard, we'll find another way. Victoria looked toward the window where reporters still clustered. I hate this feeling. Every minute that passes, I feel everything slipping away from me. Do you think people who manipulate the truth ever feel guilty, or are they too focused on winning? Share your thoughts. In a quieter corner, Helen sat at her old wooden desk, carefully writing line after line in neat handwriting. She was reconstructing everything she'd witnessed during the months, the afternoons Emma was punished outside, the times Victoria yelled at her in the wind, the cold days when the child wore only a thin dress. She folded the letter and addressed it to the Child Welfare Association. For Marcus, she whispered. And for her. Have you ever documented something important because you knew memory alone wouldn't be enough? What was it? That night, Morrison sent Richard a message. The news surprised him. Several neighbors had started coming forward, sending old photos they'd inadvertently taken, capturing Emma standing outside for hours, beneath the layer of rumors Victoria had woven. The truth was quietly accumulating piece by piece. James also brought 2 more video clips. He opened the folder on his phone, his hand trembling slightly but his eyes resolute. I forgot I'd saved these clips. They might help. Richard accepted them. One clip showed Emma trying to lift a water bucket too heavy for her. Another showed her sitting on the steps, clutching her stomach in pain and trying to regulate her breathing. Richard watched each video slowly. Emma slept right beside him, her breathing shallow. He gently placed his hand over the blanket enveloping her, trying to prevent her warmth from fading. What would you do if you had evidence that could change everything? Would you use it, even if it meant making enemies? In that moment, Richard understood this battle was no longer about restoring Marcus's truth or protecting his own honor. This was a fight for a child to live her final days with the decency she'd never received. He played the last clip on the hard drive. The image appeared slowly, the Sterling house hallway late at night. Edward emerged from a dark corner, his eyes looking directly at the camera before he turned away. That image made Richard rise from his chair, his breath heavy with sudden understanding. Edward didn't just know about Emma's situation, he was manipulating far more than Richard had suspected. The image of Edward standing in the house hallway became clearer as Richard enlarged the video. His gaze was directed straight at the camera, as if fully aware he was being recorded. What caught Richard's attention most was the timestamp. It coincided with the weeks just before Emma's health drastically worsened. He immediately sent the video to Morrison. Less than 10 minutes later, his phone rang. Morrison spoke quickly, his voice urgent. "This time frame matches a document Marcus showed me once, but it's no longer in the system. I suspect this is the key." Richard leaned on the table, his eyes looking at Emma sleeping nearby. "What document?" "Emma's extended medical file, a supplementary document Marcus mentioned but said to only use if necessary. I've reviewed the system again. A specific section has been erased. If you found out someone had tampered with critical documents, how far would you go to expose them?" "Tell me." Sarah had just entered the room. Upon hearing the words "erased document," she simply looked at Richard and sighed heavily. "I remember a special report Marcus asked me to compile. I kept it in a secure folder, but the last time I saw it was before Marcus passed." James was near the door, guarding his hands as if protecting something. "Edward was in the office a lot around that time. But I wasn't allowed to ask questions. Victoria told me to pretend I saw nothing." The three pieces of information linked together like fragments snapping into place. Richard felt he was close to crossing a line Edward had worked hard to conceal for a long time. "Have you ever connected dots that revealed a bigger picture?" "What did you discover?" At the same time, at the Sterling mansion, Victoria was hurriedly stuffing clothes into a suitcase. Her phone rang again. "Leave immediately," Edward ordered, his voice tense. "The media are still camped at the gate. Any more public appearances from you will only complicate things." "What about Richard?" "He'll trace this to the door. I'll handle it." The call ended, leaving heavy silence in the room. When Helen learned Victoria had left the mansion, she immediately went to the hospital to find Morrison. "If they're out of the house," she said as she sat down, "this is the moment to review. There are things in that house no one knows about." Morrison nodded, his eyes quickly becoming calculating. "I'll get a limited access warrant from the court. Richard can enter Marcus's study. This is our only window of opportunity." Sarah looked at Richard when she heard this. "If you decide to go, be careful. Edward isn't simple." Richard looked at Emma for a long time. Her face was light and fragile under the white lamp. "I need to know what Marcus tried to leave behind," he said softly. "And who took it? Would you risk everything to uncover a hidden truth? What would drive you to take that chance?" That night, James waited at the mansion gate. Everything was unusually quiet. The second-floor lights were completely off, with only a faint glow escaping from the first-floor hallway. "Victoria's gone," James whispered. "The house feels colder than usual." Richard nodded slightly and followed James to Marcus's study. The air here carried a familiar scent that made him pause for a moment. The room smelled of Marcus's favorite sandalwood, but everything felt more disheveled than he remembered. Some drawers were slightly ajar. There was an unusual gap on the bookshelf, as if someone had taken something important and then tried to stuff other books to cover the space. James examined each drawer, trying to remember how they used to be arranged. "Someone's been here." "Not the cleaning staff, they never touched this area." While James checked the desk, Richard ran his hand along the bookshelf's edge. He remembered Marcus saying once, "If I'm ever not here, you'll find the box." Richard crouched behind the last row of books and touched a cool wooden object, a small box pushed firmly against the wall, clearly hidden on purpose. He pulled it out and placed it on the desk. James stopped working. Both men realized what they'd found wasn't merely decorative. What's the most important thing someone has entrusted to you? Did you honor that trust? Richard opened the box. Inside was a packet of documents sealed with old rope and a thin envelope inscribed with Marcus's handwriting. The document's cover clearly read, "Protective Clause." James read the words silently, his brow furrowed. "I've worked here a long time, but I've never heard of this clause." Richard opened the envelope. The letter was brief, written only weeks before Marcus's accident. "If anything happens, find Richard. He knows what's right." Below was Marcus's signature, familiar and firm. Richard gripped the letter, his heart beating faster, realizing this wasn't just paperwork. This was Marcus's personal message to him, and possibly the final key to understanding everything Edward was trying to hide. James was about to say something when both men froze simultaneously. A very faint sound echoed from the front of the house, the soft metallic squeak of a hinge, as if someone had just moved the door. James looked at Richard. Richard gently placed the document down, signaling silence. The front door opened, revealing a thin sliver of light enough to make James stop and quickly look at Richard. Both men were almost holding their breath. Footsteps advanced slowly. James took half a step forward, slightly turning his shoulder as if preparing to block the path if necessary. When the figure became clearer, Richard realized the person was much smaller than Edward. The person who entered wasn't who they expected. "Mr. Hayes?" A soft but surprised woman's voice spoke. It was Grace, the housekeeper. James relaxed his shoulders, and Richard simply let out a long sigh. Grace hugged a cloth bag as if fearing someone would snatch it from her. "I came back for my things. Victoria told me to take temporary leave. I saw the study light on, so..." She looked at her feet, then confessed, "I was worried something was wrong." "Have you ever arrived somewhere at exactly the right moment, like fate brought you there?" "Tell me about it." Richard placed the wooden box on Marcus's old desk, his eyes still fixed on Grace. "You arrived at the perfect time." Grace looked at the box, her eyes widening when she saw the words "Protective Clause." She approached, almost dropping her bag. "I know that name. Mr. Marcus mentioned it once. It's a contingency clause." "Contingency for what?" James asked. Grace looked around, making sure no one else was listening before speaking. "Before he passed, he told me if Emma's condition worsened, and if Victoria didn't act appropriately, he'd grant temporary guardianship to the person he trusted most." She turned to Richard. "And that person is you." The statement settled heavily in the room. James looked at Richard to confirm if he was truly aware of this, but clearly Richard was as surprised as they were. "If someone entrusted you with their child's life, would you be ready? How would that change you?" Richard broke the seal. The pages inside were dated during the period when Marcus felt he was involved in something dangerous. Each line was clear: Emma's treatment schedule, her checkup timetable, and Marcus's handwritten notes with instructions on how to identify if the child was being neglected or subjected to unusual stress. "Marcus knew things would escalate to this point," Richard said softly. Unable to hide his anguish, Grace shook her head. "I just know he was worried. He said Edward had been accessing some of the family investment accounts and Victoria wasn't the person he trusted." Richard gently squeezed the document's edge. "That means Edward's been searching this room for exactly this." James looked inside the old drawers. "Definitely. This area was already altered before." Grace looked at the two men, her voice trembling. "If they find out you were here tonight..." "We have no other choice," Richard interrupted. "If this document is discovered first, everything will vanish. When the stakes are highest, do you play it safe or risk everything? What's your instinct?" As they prepared to leave the study, headlights cut through the window curtains. Grace immediately drew the curtains, her breathing interrupted. "That's Edward's car. I've seen it many times. Whenever Victoria needs to clear a path, he appears." James turned off the study light instantly. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint blue glow of the old computer screen. "We have to leave now," James said urgently. "If he sees Mr. Hayes' car outside, everything will explode." They moved quickly through the narrow hallway leading to the back of the house. James controlled each step on the wooden floor to avoid making noise. Grace gripped the stair railing, cautious with every movement, fearful the person in the main hall would hear them as they approached the back door. Richard heard the front door swing wide open. The metallic sound echoed through the empty house. Without looking, everyone knew Edward had entered. James whispered, pointing toward the glass door leading to the back patio. That way, hurry. When you had to escape a dangerous situation, what kept you calm? Or did panic take over? The three slipped through the opening and melted into the garden's darkness. The cold, damp grass soaked their shoes, but no one dared stop. The night wind whispered through the trees, carrying away their short, agitated breaths. Richard held the wooden box firmly against his chest, as if releasing it for a moment would make the entire battle collapse. Behind them, inside the house, the sound of the study door being slammed open echoed loudly, a dry, sharp sound, as if someone had struck it forcefully. James turned to glance back, but Richard indicated not to look again. Let's go, now. Grace moved faster, grabbing James's arm. If Edward finds out we took that, Richard responded softly, his eyes focused on the back garden gate. He won't rest until he finds it. But tonight, we were one step ahead. Heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway inside the house, as if someone was heading directly to the room they'd just vacated. Gracella Larick. A nighttime escape scene in a mansion's back garden. 3 figures run across wet lawn toward iron gate in distance, a man in cream suit clutching a wooden box, an elderly groundskeeper and a housekeeper. Behind them, the mansion's windows glow with lights suddenly switching on. Moonlight breaks through clouds, illuminating their desperate flight. Wet grass, shadows from topiary trees, sense of urgency and danger. Photorealistic, cinematic composition, dramatic lighting contrast. It wasn't yet daylight when Richard stopped at Morrison's legal office. The morning air was cool but carried a sense of intense pressure. He held the wooden box in his hand like something that could change everything, and indeed it could. Morrison stood, immediately after opening the box in front of him. I didn't think Marcus would go to such extremes, he said, his eyes glued to the carefully sealed clause. Marcus's handwriting clear, illegibly sharp. With this document, everything changes. James stood behind, his hands unconsciously clenched. Grace leaned slightly, as if seeing Marcus again in each stroke of the pen. He was always worried about Emma, she said softly. I just regret no one realized it sooner. Morrison immediately called his assistant, requesting preparations for an emergency hearing. When he asked for all the videos James had provided, James placed the small USB drive on the desk. I just hope everything's presented exactly as I witnessed it, James said, his eyes heavy with emotion. I'll make sure of it, Morrison nodded, his hand resting on the document like a commitment. Have you ever had to present evidence that could change someone's life? How did it feel carrying that responsibility? Helen also arrived early, carrying the letter she'd spent all night writing. I tried to remember every detail, she said, handing the letter to Morrison. What I saw may be small, but I don't want it to vanish in silence anymore. Meanwhile, at the Sterling mansion, Edward stood in Marcus's study, his face tense like a stretched wire. The cabinet was wide open, papers scattered, and what irritated him most was the missing wooden box. Richard was here, he said into the phone, his voice cold, trying to maintain calm, but his hand continuously tapping the desk. And he found what I tried to keep hidden. On the other end of the line, Victoria remained silent for a few seconds before responding. And now what do we do? The media are focusing on me. Keep engaging with the press. Don't let anyone see you crumble, Edward said. He clenched his jaw. I'll handle the rest. Victoria looked at herself in the bedroom mirror. Despite heavy makeup, signs of exhaustion were evident. But she had no alternative. She could only maintain the role of the misunderstood mother a little longer. Do people who lie to themselves eventually start believing their own stories? What do you think? At the hospital, Sarah checked Emma's vital signs for the 3rd time that morning. The child lay on her side, her hand gripping the worn teddy bear tightly. Each time the child's breathing faltered, Sarah's heart felt a painful squeeze. James arrived with news of the afternoon court hearing. Sarah looked up, her eyes slightly relieved. "I hope this time something changes," she said. "Emma needs to get out of that house." Richard arrived shortly after. He remained by Emma's bedside for a long time, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Uncle's here," he whispered, though he knew Emma was in a semi-conscious state. "You just have to hold on a little longer." Sarah stood silently nearby, watching Richard's eyes, then spoke. "He trusted you. Marcus did. If he were alive, he'd know he chose the right person." Richard didn't respond, simply nodded slightly, as if promising both Marcus and Emma. "Who has shown up for you when you needed them most? Have you told them what it meant to you?" By afternoon, the courthouse was unusually crowded. The hallways filled with reporters whispering about the story of the tech magnate and the sick little girl, all trying to predict the next development. Victoria arrived with Edward. She wore a neutral-colored coat to appear discreet, but the hand hidden in the fabric still trembled slightly. Edward maintained a composed look, but his eyes moved constantly, trying to gauge the media's reaction. Morrison arrived just before proceedings, carrying the wooden box. When Richard and James emerged from the elevator, numerous camera flashes erupted simultaneously. But Grace's appearance walking just behind Richard surprised many reporters. They recognized her as the loyal housekeeper of the Sterling family. Sarah was also present. Despite her aversion to crowded places, she stood next to Richard in the front row. "Emma couldn't come," she said softly. "But I brought the records." "We'll speak for her," Richard responded. "We will. If you could speak for someone who has no voice, what would you say? Tell me in the comments." The hearing began in tense silence. The judge reviewed the documents, and after only a few minutes, his gaze settled on the protective clause. "This has never been presented before," he said, looking at Morrison. Morrison stood. "Your Honor, this is a clause drafted by Mr. Marcus Sterling before his passing, with legal certification. The content explicitly states that if the current guardian doesn't safeguard his daughter's welfare, temporary guardianship will be transferred to Mr. Richard Hayes." Victoria stood abruptly. "I've never heard of this. It could be a fabrication." "Are you suggesting the signature is forged?" Morrison lifted the letter with Marcus's signature. "You lived with him, ma'am. Surely you recognize your husband's handwriting." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but words stuck in her throat. Leaving her eyes searching for a foothold. "Have you ever watched someone's lies unravel in real time? How did it make you feel?" The judge requested more evidence. James was called to the stand first. He stood beside the witness box, hands gripping the paper firmly. When the first video clip played showing Emma stumbling while sweeping the patio on a cold night, no one in the room could maintain an emotionless facade. The screen then changed to footage of Emma collapsing in the kitchen. Sarah lowered her head, her hand pressed against her forehead. Helen, sitting behind, gently brought a tissue to her eyes. Several reporters stopped mid-click of the shutter. Morrison continued. "This is evidence the child wasn't receiving proper care, contrary to Mrs. Victoria's testimony." Victoria breathed sharply. "She was already sick. I did the best I could." "A gravely ill child can't sweep the patio on a cold night," Sarah spoke, stepping toward the stand. "She can't miss 3 months of vital treatment. She can't perform all household chores while anemic and exhausted. I'm her doctor. I know this is true." When you see injustice exposed, do you feel relief or anger or both? Share what you're feeling right now. Edward, sitting behind Victoria, his face went rigid. The judge reviewed more documents, then looked at both parties. "This is only a temporary hearing. But based on the evidence presented, I'm provisionally transferring Emma's guardianship to Mr. Richard Hayes. I'm also ordering a full investigation into the living conditions at the Sterling mansion." The hearing concluded amid loud murmuring. Victoria's face was ashen, and Edward stood immediately, rushing toward the back door as if to avoid camera lenses. Richard felt no joy. This decision was only the first step, not the final victory. He only breathed easier thinking Emma would leave the mansion and be placed somewhere safe.
James stood near the courtroom exit, trying to call his children's caregiver, but the signal was weak. As he descended the courthouse steps, Richard was about to approach him when he suddenly froze. A group of 3 men leaned against the railing, their eyes fixed on James. One of them nodded slightly, as if indicating they'd found their target. Richard immediately headed toward the group. As Richard approached, the 3 men dispersed instantly, hurrying toward the parking lot as if they'd received a retreat signal. One looked back, but meeting Richard's intense gaze, immediately turned away. Only seconds later, a dark sedan sped out of the courthouse gate, leaving a faint cloud of dust in the pale afternoon light. James stood motionless on the stone steps.
When Richard reached him, he whispered, "Thank you."
"If you hadn't appeared." He didn't finish the sentence, but his grateful eyes spoke volumes. Richard placed a hand on James's shoulder.
"We're on the same side. Don't let them intimidate you."
James nodded, and both returned to the hospital. Have you ever been protected by someone when you felt most vulnerable?
How did that change your relationship with them?
In the critical care unit, Sarah was adjusting Emma's breathing tube.
The child was awake, her eyes slightly open as she tried to observe everyone in the room.
When Richard entered, her eyes brightened a little,
and her small arm trembled slightly as it stretched toward him. Richard approached, sitting beside the bed.
"Uncle's here," he said softly, placing his hand over hers.
Trying to keep it warm. Emma gently tilted her head, leaning into his palm as if seeking familiar comfort.
Sarah observed the scene for a long time and smiled faintly.
"She stabilizes when you're here," she whispered,
turning a page in the file to hide the emotion building inside her. A moment later, Helen arrived. She entered with a small wool blanket, carefully folded.
"I have this for you, sweetheart," she said, placing the blanket on Emma's chest.
"I knitted it myself. I hope it keeps you warmer." Emma touched the blanket, her finger lightly grazing the yarn.
A small fragile smile appeared on her pale face. Richard watched,
feeling as if his heart had just been gently reassured.
"What small gesture of kindness has stayed with you forever?
Tell me about it."
Not long after, Morrison called. Richard stepped into the hallway to answer.
"The main hearing is in 3 days. Good news. The family foundation records are showing significant discrepancies," Morrison said. "If we confirm Edward's financial manipulation, things will take a definitive turn." "What about Emma?"
Richard asked.
"We need to secure full guardianship.
Otherwise, everything could revert to square one."
Richard gripped the phone tightly. "We will." When he returned to the room, James had just arrived carrying an envelope Grace had asked him to deliver. Richard opened it and scanned through. It was a backup of Marcus's work notes from his last 2 months. Marcus's strong handwriting clearly stated, "Amend will. Secure Emma's rights.
Re-examine Edward's transactions."
Richard took a deep breath. "This is the key," he told James. "If these notes are authenticated, Edward won't be able to escape." James looked at Emma from a distance, his eyes filled with remorse. "You're helping me correct the silence I kept for so long.
Now it's my turn to do my part. What silence have you broken that changed everything? Or what silence are you still carrying?"
As night fell, Sarah remained on watch.
The lines on Emma's respiratory monitor moved continuously, keeping her tense. But each time Richard returned to the bedside, Emma seemed to stabilize, her breathing becoming more even. Sarah watched them both silently, then added a line to her file.
"She's conserving her strength," she said softly.
"I believe Emma wants to wait until everything's officially safe." Richard looked at Emma's sparse hair, a knot forming in his throat.
He gently stroked the remaining strands,
careful not to cause her pain. Around midnight, James went out to buy coffee and saw a familiar silhouette near the hospital entrance.
Victoria stood under yellow light, her shoulders rigid with tension. When she saw James, she approached him.
"James, I want to see her."
"I'm still her mother," she said, her voice tense but her breathing unsteady. James stepped forward to block her path.
"You no longer have that right. And she doesn't need more stress from you."
If someone who hurt you wanted forgiveness, would you give it?
Or does some damage go too deep?
Victoria grabbed her purse, her eyes red, but was forced to turn away. She pulled out her phone and immediately called Edward, clearly agitated. James watched her, understanding she was rapidly losing control. Across the city, Edward sat in his own study facing stacks of documents marked in red.
He read each report, growing angrier with each page. The media backlash combined with the ongoing financial investigation was costing him his composure.
"We can't let him win," Edward said into the phone, his voice heavy as if forced through his teeth. "If Victoria doesn't sign the waiver, we'll both sink to the bottom."
Victoria responded in panic. "What do you want me to sign? If I do that, I lose everything."
"You lost it the moment you let Richard interfere," Edward declared, ignoring the trembling on the other end.
"Now you're just choosing to lose less."
Victoria ended the call silently. She leaned against the glass door, tears falling. But there was no one there to comfort her. Back at the hospital, Richard sat beside Emma, one hand holding the wooden box under his jacket,
the other gripping the child's hand. "I won't let anyone hurt you again," he whispered. Each word slow and deliberate. Emma stirred slightly, her eyes opening weakly,
her small finger gently squeezing his hand. Sarah stood on the other side of the bed, witnessing the moment, a mixed sensation of sadness and gratitude that life had brought Richard back at just the right time. Helen returned with a small box of cookies and placed them on the side table.
"I thought Emma might smell them. Maybe it'll cheer her up."
She put a hand on Richard's shoulder.
"Today is day 34. She's come much further than anyone predicted."
Richard looked at the child for a long time. "We have to finish this before it's too late."
James stood near the door, gripping his hot coffee cup.
"We will," he said, his eyes focused on Emma, as if reminding himself to pay the debt of months of silence. How many days would you fight for someone, even if you knew time was running out? "Tell me." In the softly lit room, these strangers were slowly becoming an improvised family, all for the sake of a fragile child clinging to each breath, waiting for the day justice would be served. Richard looked back at the document Marcus had left behind. His friend's handwriting reminded him this conflict wasn't just about duty, but about a friendship that had never really ended. Sarah hurried into
the room just as the waves on the monitor slipped into soft,
weak pulses.
2 nurses followed her, quickly adjusting the oxygen, gently raising the bed's headdress to help Emma breathe more easily. The child lay still,
her lips dry, each breath coming in thin, weak gasps. Richard stood right beside her,
his hand still gripping the wooden box under his coat as if it were the last part of Marcus that needed to be fulfilled.
He placed his hand over Emma's, holding it firmly so she'd feel his presence.
"Uncle's here,"
he said softly,
not daring to raise his voice for fear of startling her. "When someone you love is slipping away, what do you say?
Or do words even matter anymore?" A nurse looked at Richard, then at the monitor. "She can still feel your presence," she said gently,
trying to keep the space respectful. Outside in the hallway,
James stood guard by the door, his back slightly pressed against the wall. He remained perfectly silent, fearful any sound might stress Emma. Helen sat on the bench across,
her hands gripping the new wool blanket.
Grace sat beside her, simply placing her hand over Helen's as they consoled each other in silence. No one spoke. Everyone seemed to be listening to the weak, fading breaths from the patient's room. Richard's phone vibrated in his pocket. He stepped out for only a few seconds to hear Morrison's news.
"We just received final notification. Edward's been detained for investigation.
Victoria has been formally stripped of all guardianship rights and assets."
"Understood," Richard responded briefly, his eyes fixed on the room.
"I'll call you back when I'm done here." "Richard," Morrison added, his voice slower. "Marcus's file changed everything. He was right to choose you."
Richard didn't respond, simply nodded slightly.
He hung up and returned to the room. Sarah was adjusting the foredrip.
Seeing Richard, she gestured for him to come closer. "Her heart rate is declining rapidly," she whispered.
"If you want to say something, now is the time."
If you had one last chance to speak to someone, what would you say? Would you find the words? Richard placed the wooden box on the table beside the bed and opened the lid. Marcus's letter lay there, familiar words crossing time. If I'm ever not here, be her protector in my place. I trust you, Richard. Richard left the letter and sat closer to the bed. Emma tried to open her eyes. The room was so quiet, only the constant sound of the air pump could be heard. I'm here, Richard whispered. No one will hurt you anymore. You're safe now. Emma blinked slowly, as if trying to keep her gaze steady. Her fingers moved slightly, seeking his hand. Richard held it, maintaining his grip firm but gentle. She took a weak breath, half effort, half desire to say something, but lacked the strength. Sarah stood nearby, watching every small movement. Her eyes were red, but she maintained composure, knowing Emma needed absolute tranquility. She knows you're holding her hand, she said softly. Have you ever held someone's hand as they left this world? What did that moment teach you about life? Outside, James pressed his hand against his forehead, breathing deeply, trying to stay upright. Helen bowed her head in silent prayer. Grace covered her mouth with her hand to muffle a sob. In the room, the white ceiling lamp's light shone on Emma's face, making her pale skin seem even more fragile. Richard leaned closer, his face only inches from hers. He knew this was the moment she'd been clinging to all these days. You're not alone, he said. I promise you. Emma gently tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint line, the smallest, softest smile she could manage. Sarah raised her hand to her chest, feeling as if her heart had just been tightly squeezed. The wave on the monitor began to slow, a gentle curve lengthened, then fell. The nurse stepped forward but stopped when Sarah raised a hand, signaling to preserve the peace. Richard leaned in, his forehead lightly touching the child's hand. You did so well, Emma. You were braver than anyone I've ever known. One final pulse. Then silence. No panic. No blaring alarm. Just complete stillness enveloped the room, a stillness, like when a gentle wind departs from a place where it had found refuge. Sarah bowed her head. She's gone, she said with a faint breath. But in peace. Richard didn't release her hand until the small fingers cooled. He placed Helen's wool blanket over Emma's chest as a farewell, then gently closed her eyes. When you think about a peaceful ending, what does that look like to you? Is peace something we give or something we find? When the door opened, James straightened immediately, his face rigid with repressed emotion. Helen covered her mouth, her tears falling without sound. Grace brought her hand to her chest, stepping back slightly to avoid collapsing. Richard walked toward the hallway with the wooden box pressed against his chest. No one spoke. No words were necessary. Everyone understood that what mattered most had been preserved. Emma didn't leave in fear. Not alone. And not under the painful coercion of the Sterling house. He looked at the group waiting. James, Sarah, Helen, Grace, all looking toward him like the remaining witnesses of the love Marcus had left behind. Richard tightened his grip on the wooden box, his hand trembling slightly but his gaze resolute. He knew he had to continue what Marcus hadn't been able to complete. And he also knew that from this moment on, his life would be forever tied to two promises. The promise to Marcus, and the promise to a small child who fought until her last breath. What promise are you carrying that you haven't fulfilled yet? Is today the day you start? And that's our bedtime story for today. It was a long journey, filled with pain but also with people who chose to stand on the side of light. If only to protect a small, fragile child in her final days. How do you feel hearing about the final moment when Emma held Richard's hand? What detail moved you most? Marcus's letter, Richard's unwavering determination, James's courage, or the quiet affection of Sarah, Grace, and Helen? And among all the characters, who left you with the deepest impression? Please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can connect and remember the beautiful journey Emma left behind. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to my channel and like this video. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to people who need hope, healing, and the reminder that even in darkness, there are those who choose to be light. Thank you for being here. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere, somehow, someone is fighting for what's right. Just like you would